Dramatic events of violence have pushed me into pretty interesting conversations in my life, and I don't think that's unique at all. After 9/11, when I was on a college campus, I became very interested in intellectual and philosophical debates regarding violence, motivations for violence, histories of colonialization, the truth claims of religions, religious justifications, or supposed radicalization processes. Generally, the question of just why did that crazy, awful thing just happen? That event steered my mind and my studies into the realm of moral philosophy. And I was on my way to a film degree by the time all of that had happened, and I continued down that path, but mentally my interests and efforts in storytelling and philosophy started to merge. And over the next decade, I worked in film, continuing my philosophy education and personal exploration. And the conversation regarding Islam, America's foreign policy, the spectacle and propaganda surrounding what we call terrorism, and much more kind of began its downward spiral into stupidity and madness all around me. And I was quite concerned, especially as the mind-numbing 2016 election was coalescing, which seemed to represent a real looming inflection point. I began to get more directly involved with what became very stupidly titled IDW, or Intellectual Dark Web, which sort of bubbled up from the energy of kind of the new atheist conversation of the previous decade. And more I tried to use my creative and storytelling skills to help further the conversations and amplify certain stages. I eventually made a documentary film based on a book, which was really just a transcription of a few phone call conversations between Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz. That was entitled Islam and the Future of Tolerance. This was right as the 2016 election was marching towards a cliff. I was proud of that film. I still am. Though I regret some missed opportunities in and around it, which I was probably too timid to approach at the time. But I wanted to faithfully translate their clash and subsequent intellectual entanglement, which I do think was conducted in good spirit and good faith and contained a lot of important moments of discovery and understanding for the reader or viewer, possibly more so than the participants themselves. But yeah, I wanted to adapt their exchange to the screen with as much fidelity to the spirit and content of the people involved. And in that respect, I think, or I hope, it was successful, regardless of what I personally thought of their argumentation. And then time went on as social media continued to swallow the world. And I don't think I need to rehash the, continued messy disintegration of the general group of thinkers of which I was around or collaborating with or adjacent to at that time. I think that's been done plenty of times. I have an essay on that on my site entitled Be Careful in the Dark. But over the next 5 years or so after 2016, I probably foolishly tried to cling to some of the energy and intellectual curiosity of the crowds and communities which had been magnetized and loosely arranged by these provocative questions and thinkers, or better described as personalities than thinkers, honestly. It was always my motivation and inspiration to see how much we could all kind of elevate and engage our discourse with some fairly dangerous and taboo and fragile subjects that I thought and still think are vitally important and meaningful. Looking back on it, I likely failed to truly recognize 2016 as a point where I and many other people maybe should have switched modes of conversation and maybe altered our efforts. I should have bowed out of my social media habit around that time, but it would take about 5 more years for that to happen. So I continued to be involved with some of this stuff, even while accusations of grifting were lobbed at many of the people around me, which was not unfounded. And the loose configuration of personalities and intellectual tribes just started to splinter kind of one by one. Honestly, it was all a bit disappointing for me to witness. And to summarize it, I often quote two of those personalities who were in a conversation in the early stages of this fraying energy. It was Brett Weinstein speaking to Dave Rubin, and Brett very casually said, "Truth-seeking will not survive market forces." I don't know if this was just a bit of personal warning, but it does a decent job at trying to, put a sad little bow on the entire situation. And of course, it's much more than just economic or financial market forces on their own. The forces at play are entirely universal and psychological, which work against truth-seeking in all forms. And it's exactly those psychological and maybe even those spiritual forces, let alone the basic financial incentives of grifting, which I always knew were severely lacking on those IDW stages. I always thought that by leaving those vulnerable and potentially shameful psychological weaknesses and factors out of the room and away from, the intellectual pursuits, the entire thing just reeked of dishonesty and was really doomed to fail in exactly the way I think it did. I realize I'm speaking a bit cryptically there, and I write about it in that essay in a similarly vague way. Doing otherwise just kind of risks being a purveyor of gossip and sounding kind of petty. But I've never really been able to successfully walk that balance beam. And so that's the best I can do. I know that many of these personalities that I'm gesturing towards really have done very little to earn the kind of respect for honesty, holding the positions that they claim to hold, or for me to respond to them so seriously. But I'm going to try to continue in that direction with taking it philosophically seriously. So even if they don't take themselves that seriously. And then, when October 7th, 2023 happened, and the perhaps most taboo and entangled conversation, which was always avoided intentionally in a tremendously cynical and cowardly way in those conversations in the previous 2 decades, suddenly it was unavoidably front and center in everyone's mind. And I just couldn't stay quiet anymore about the deep differences regarding historical facts and knowledge, of course, but more so the attitudes regarding the importance of history itself. Needless to say, just about everyone who used to walk onto those debate stages and enter those conversations was making massively problematic statements and seemed to display almost no intellectual humility or curiosity. And to many were honestly plainly revealed to be just massively unprincipled hypocrites, or just flat out tribal essentialists, Western chauvinists, or dare I say bigots and racists. Of course, they always may have been those things, but now there was little hiding it. And so, of course, over the past year and a half, I've had some, to be honest, pretty awful, failed private conversations with some of these people. I was hoping that at least a few of these would have resulted in a good public one, but no dice. And if that's any of you out there, if you happen to be watching this, I'm sorry those didn't go so well. I'm sure I didn't always handle myself as well as I could have. It's a fairly emotional topic. You likely got burned by some of the steam and water which had boiled over in my mind over the last few decades of silence on this, frustrating silence, and my conversational door is still open perpetually. But since I've been more outspoken on this subject, I've been constantly asked why I don't debate someone on this issue who disagrees with me. I'm aware that my conversation partners from Ilan Pape and Miko Peled and Richard English to a degree, Vijay Prashad, David Sinai, Dirk Moses, etc., just about everyone I've had on the show talking to me about it generally agrees with my worldview and argumentation. And I obviously think that there's a lot of value in those types of engagements. I never want to just be preaching to the choir, but I think there's always room to sharpen and upgrade and self-challenge a position that we might hold or I might hold or have a strong emotional response to. So that's kind of been my role. But I do think there is a value in debate and engagements and entanglements with people who really sharply disagree with you when it's done well. When both parties are actually interested in honestly finding and then presenting the difference between them rather than trying to win or dunk or own or whatever kind of, contests the internet has so sadly incentivized. And, I've tried to set up those debates myself, and I know there have been other people and mutual acquaintances and friends who've also tried to set those up with me as a participant, and all of that has been to no avail. So I decided to go ahead and just start one of these debates by myself. And so this video and this essay is going to be an opening statement that I would give in such a debate. And I think debates in general, it's important and useful to have a fairly confined and well-written statement to discuss in that sort of Oxford-style debate format. I like that. But I think this one would likely be written and delivered in a fairly broad manner, perhaps something like Israel should be supported, or Israel is doing what it has to do. Or maybe if it's even like a question like, how should we morally evaluate Israel's behavior? Something like that. So if by chance I do enter a formal debate on this subject, I'd of course adjust my writing and argumentation appropriately to the specific motion, whatever it is. I really don't like it when debaters just have a generic argumentation and don't bother to address and focus in on a well-written motion. But for this one, please allow the kind of vague point of contention, that question maybe, how should we morally evaluate Israel's behavior? And then just one more thing, a little announcement before I deliver my opening statement about this channel. I'm going to be taking a bit of a break over this spring and maybe into summer from my sort of new YouTube interviews and essays. I really just need some time to focus on the book that I'm drafting at the moment, which is all about moral philosophy and the relationship between technological and moral progress, and what we really might mean when we say that someone is on the right or wrong side of history. And overall, it's going to present, I think, my provocative thesis about what moral progress really means or should mean, as opposed to maybe moral purity or a kind of assumed utilitarian mathematics and ethics. So anyway, it's been a ton of fun to write so far, so I think it'll be fun to read. I've been immersed in some really fascinating areas of history, and I'm weaving together a lot of findings from moral psychology and, of course, moral philosophy to deliver, I think, a kind of gut punch thesis about the world we are generating out there. So if you like anything that I do, or even if you kind of hate it, but you want to argue with me, I'm sure you'll love the book. So give me time to write it. I need time to write it. But in the meantime, over this spring and into the summer, I'm going to be pushing out some of my older audio-only episodes that I think are just like crazy relevant and interesting. And I'm going to be doing that over here on YouTube since I've sort of gone to this video format. So I'll give a brief video introduction to them if I push them out and line them up and schedule them. For example, I have like an insanely cool and important conversation that I recorded with David Goldberger a few years ago. It's about free speech, which is obviously really relevant now. He was the ACLU lawyer who represented the Nazis who wanted to march in Skokie, Illinois. A pretty famous case. It's super relevant, obviously, to the crackdowns on free speech and the madness going on with the ICE deportations of pro-Palestine protesters and everything. Anyway, I'll try to push those out every few weeks over the spring, just for you to have a conversation space and because I think they're really awesome. So please do like and subscribe to me and all that stuff. Keep an eye on me. Keep me in your rotation. And I'll be back with new essays and interviews later in the calendar year. Including the one that I keep teasing when I'm going to be sitting down with my mother to discuss her journey, maybe our journey with Judaism and Israel and Zionism and all that. So I really do appreciate all of you, and like and subscribe. So now, my opening statement in this debate, which still awaits a debate partner. I'm clearly thinking of someone like Sam Harris, because I know his arguments so well, to be on the other half of this hypothetical stage, but it really could be any number of people who have laid out similar lines of argumentation. So forgive a bit of my make-believe. I have a podium here, I even have water, and my performance, because why not have some fun with it? And so now I would be called to the podium for the debate on the question, how should we morally evaluate Israel's behavior? The audience claps and the timer starts. So I want to start, admittedly playfully, maybe ironically, with a bit of a preemptive strike of sorts. I want to pluck out one particular line from my opponent, which I think is doing a lot of work, because I think the best forms of these debates are not really about convincing the other person to jump their proverbial position ship, though that would be nice if he just, fully agreed with me at the end of this debate, or of course if any witness of the debate did the same, but I don't think that's really likely or realistic. So rather, I think it's best to search for and then present clearly and honestly the genuine philosophical or perhaps psychological fissure and departure point which is present here. Because I do think there is a real departure point between us on this stage, which is not or won't be, or I think can't be, resolved by having more facts or information about the situation of Israel and Palestine. So I'd like to find that point with you. There are such things as real philosophical and psychological differences, and I think it's the case, and it's hidden in a seemingly innocuous line, which my opponent recently wrote. The line is just simply, sometimes war is necessary. I believe this is a bit of shadowboxing against maybe a purely pacifist position or philosophy, and I hope that you will hear that that is not quite the position that I will be suggesting or that I hold, but okay. Sometimes war is necessary. That's the line doing the work. And I suspect that what the audience will hear tonight from my opponent is a very well-argued and reasoned description of the conditions for the statement to become true, that sometimes war is necessary. And presumably, my opponent will argue that in this case, those conditions are unfortunately met, and thus it is unfortunately necessary for war now. And this, notice, is kind of a shrewd tactic. I'll point it out because it allows the presenter of this argument to maintain a sort of compassion or admirable almost regret, or even lamenting the fact that their hand is forced into such an admittedly awful condition as war. And I will grant and predict that my opponent will tell you about all of the ways that he knows that war is truly awful. And he will mean these things. He will talk about the moral nightmare of so-called collateral damage. He will admit that war always comes with maybe unavoidable overreach or bad apples who do some downright ugly things that should be prosecuted and criticized. He'll probably criticize them. He will leave open the possibility that war may be conducted in some unwise or unproductive ways. He will think that reserving all of this type of criticism for the ones who were forced into war by the necessary conditions, which he will elaborate, will distinguish his position as the civilized and moral one. And he will hold this attitude up as the important kind of North Star to keep in mind, the bright line, as it were. And he will warn that if it's forgotten, this moral North Star, then we will lose ourselves and become the barbarians whom we have been so unlucky to contend with. To point to the conditions in which war is necessary, he will use the words deranged and suicidal and death-loving often. The word deranged is the important one to pay attention to there, for it implies yet another level of compassion and lamentation from his position. It allows him to describe the target under a military drone, for example, to be an unfortunate human who has just been hijacked by murderous ideas and blinded by captivating ideologies and maybe alluring religious myths, which unfortunately have rendered this human system just unworkable or perhaps impossible to tolerate in a civilizational project which is generally interested in increasing flourishing and freedom. This description of derangement also allows, theoretically, for the possibility of reformation or de-radicalization, de-derangement, if you will. And this allows the debater to deflect charges of bigotry or ethnic dehumanization, because if he could, he would simply undo or unwind the derangement, and then he would have no problem embracing this person, regardless of his or her ethnicity or lifestyle. In fact, he thinks those underanged or non-deranged unlucky souls caught up in this madness are the most important people to champion or protect. And perhaps those people should, move to the front of the line of immigration or rescue or something like that. All of these proclamations will build his moral defense. All of this, like I said, will sound rational and even loving. The rather jaw-dropping quotes from someone like Golda Meir can start to sound even a little nice when she says, "We can forgive them for killing our children, but we cannot forgive them for making us kill theirs." There in that quote, the "making us" is the reference to the apparently real conditions where war becomes unfortunately necessary, which includes, I suppose, having no choice but to kill children. The entire line of argumentation and this focus on the deranged ideas running kind of like bad mind software on otherwise perfectly fine hardware brains, one kind of pictures like a zombie film where people have been infected by something which renders them irredeemably dangerous. And now notice how this entire angle on the questions at hand of the so-called necessity of war in certain situations has a way of de-emphasizing the past or history. The history of the derangement process might be academically interesting and perhaps could hold some evidence to help out in the de-derangement or maybe prevention of other derangements. But the immediate emergency is to handle the wild and rabid, deranged zombie in front of you, intent on killing you. Now, I hope all of that was generally fair regarding the role of history, and I very much want to avoid turning this into a research battle. I don't think either of us are entirely equipped for such an entanglement, though I think some level of knowledge of particular facts about the changing conditions of the necessity of war are really unavoidable, or at least quite absurd to be ignorant of if one dares engage on this topic. But as I said before, I think if one pays careful attention to my argumentation, they will hear an amount of charity of the merits of such a conversation in search of that elusive philosophical spirit without the research. So to now turn from the, no doubt important question of what conditions might render war morally necessary or at least morally permissible, even with its unfortunate collateral damage or other concomitant dangers of overreach or even a kind of induced derangement, all topics my opponent will no doubt stress many times. I'd like to pose what I think the actual debate and much more pertinent question really is, and that is this one. If war is sometimes necessary, is resistance ever necessary? And of course, by swapping out the word war for resistance, we are already faced with an intriguing question as to what the difference is at all. I won't get too lost on that thread in my opening statement, though I think that would be a fruitful intellectual forest to wander into in the next round of questions. But I'll briefly offer that I think there's a kind of intuitive difference where war might be about suppression of maybe counter elements in the world, which maybe desire radical change of culture or ownership or general governance. War seems to be about stamping out a strong foe with a radically different vision of governance and ownership. And resistance is more about those latter things, maybe changing power relationships thought to be unfair and unjust or unfree. Though this is a bit semantic, there are wars of liberation and wars of revolution or wars of overthrow, perhaps. They can be fought and labeled coherently as wars, but I think without too much confusion on the matter of war and resistance, I could step to the real point, and we could all sense that the questions are different and both make sense, war and resistance. So what I'd really like my opponent to do is answer the question of when, if ever, the conditions are in place to, let's just say, morally justify resistance. And there are, of course, many forms of resistance, so I have not yet narrowed my question down to forms of armed or violent resistance, but that narrowing will get my attention. So when are the conditions in place for resistance to be necessary? My brief answer is that these conditions are ultimately subjective and subjectively defined, but they must relate to situations in which the sacred value of freedom is being violated by a person or persons or party or entity, which becomes, of course, the target of resistance. And I've now introduced the sacred value of freedom, which is certainly its own can of worms, but in my formulation of such an idea of genuine freedom, I incorporate a level of a sense of justice being present in order to experience freedom. And justice is a slippery idea, which, avoidably or unavoidably is in the conversation with the past and historical facts. That's what justice is. It's a conversation with how the past ought to relate to the present. And this opens the door to a debate about the truthfulness, of course, of historical narratives, which I doubt either of us would like to have, but I think my opponent would both recognize that, the historical narratives can be manipulated and exaggerated, completely fabricated, or be rather sound and truthful and factful. And so this is generally pretty volatile stuff. But with all of that in our collective minds, I will proffer that resistance is necessary when the status quo or the world which persists because of power ceases to be a world worth continuing. I say this because resistance always carries with it degrees of risk. And I think it implies a power asymmetry which obviously amplifies that risk of entering resistance. Okay, well, again, luckily, my opponent has actually already given us a lot of insight into this philosophical question in the way he thinks about the necessity of resistance and those conditions when they're met. And it comes from him on a different topic, on a topic that suggests what one ought to do when facing potential overstep or maybe brutality and injustice from police officers, especially when there's a suspicion of maybe a racial element in that brutality. My opponent, very reasonably and compassionately, has offered the strong advice that someone who finds themselves in the unfortunate position of being abused or brutalized, or they think they are, they ought not try to engage in violent resistance against that police officer in that moment. And we should note that this word resistance that I just used has naturally met us here. And this has been codified, at least in the American context, legal context, as the crime of resisting arrest. So one should not engage in that kind of resistance in the middle of such physical abuse or harassment from a police officer. Don't go trying to grab the officer's gun or get into a wrestling match or run, or of course grab your own weapon in those moments. All of those things are foolish and nearly suicidal. And I'll point out that in his writing on that particular topic, he also stresses agreement and even shared possible outrage and frustration with a level of incompetence or poor training, perhaps racial bias, which plagues law enforcement in the United States. But the point is, as he explains, that in the midst of those heightened, dangerous moments with trigger fingers very close to triggers, it's not the time for resistance action. The time for that action, he stresses, is later on, when perhaps the victim should go to the proper systems of regulation, maybe above this officer, go to the police station, get a lawyer, sue the department into oblivion, get this bad cop off the street, seek resolution through these, let's say, non-violent pathways of justice. This is safer for you, of course, but it's also the way to get the system to improve and to benefit the greater good. It all sounds like really sound advice, right? But there are plenty of obvious assumptions that we need to point out. One, of course, you surely noticed, is that there needs to be a trustworthy and established system of redress in place. The courts, the lawyers, the higher-ups, whoever they might be, they need to be accessible and uncorrupted for this advice to make any sense. And so we should notice the fluid nature over time of such institutions, and thus the soundness and relevance of such advice. If this brutality was happening, let's say in the year 1850, or maybe 1940, or 1960, 2015, 2025 for that matter, all of that obviously matters for the soundness of this advice. And the second thing to consider is perhaps maybe a more troubling fundamental question as to what kind of justice can be obtained through these systems of redress or whatever it is, even in kind. Could you ever really address or dissolve the sense of injustice which goes along with a form of deeply humiliating brutality, laced with historical racial domination? It's an open question as to whether any amount of money or apology could assuage such a moral trespass. But let's set that one aside for just a moment, because I think the analogies that I'm starting to lay out here are coming into view. So let's just connect those dots. So the Palestinian cause has suffered rather jaw-dropping injustices. I think even my opponent allows for this statement to be true, though our historical accounts and knowledge may paint it more or less jaw-dropping. I think it's fair to say that my opponent has had much less familiarity and knowledge on this history of injustice, which again, I can't hold against him. The world is a big place and history is an even bigger place. And I think my initial statement on derangement made clear, as it made clear, I'm not sure how much this historical knowledge of injustice would move his position in any case. So I will accept that. And I'm trying to be careful there with my language when I say the Palestinian cause has suffered injustice, as to not put the entirety of the injustice suffered by the Palestinian cause at the feet or the hands of the Zionists or the Israeli state, which the Zionist militias established through, perhaps my opponent will argue, morally justified violent forms of resistance, simply known as terrorism at the time, during their pre-1948 activities. No, the Palestinian cause is one which suffered injustice by, honestly, what seems like a pretty extraordinary sequence of historical events and forces that were all colliding, from colonial power dynamics and resource rivalries, European genocides against several persecuted groups, not the least of which were European Jews, and of course, cynical biblical exploitations, and including, I won't leave out, plenty of abandonment from Arab nations during that frantic post-war scramble for nationhood recognition in an emerging new global conversation about sovereignty in the United Nations and whatnot. As well, of course, as plenty of self-inflicted wounds of Palestinian disorganization and infighting, etc. So please hear me when I say that the Zionists, fueled by biblical justifications and religious fantasies, and perhaps the understandable heightened state of survival of a cornered animal looking for safety in a hostile world, did not engage in the brutality against the Palestinians alone. But in any case, the injustice was upon them. So let's recall that sage advice. Pursue a just outcome through measures which might succeed given the asymmetrical power dynamic, and seek out functional legal bodies, perhaps, which are in place for such things. That's the advice here. And just quickly before I lose the point, because there's a persistent myth and religious propaganda, which I think even my opponent has purported several times, that I want to stress the point I just made about the asymmetry of power when I'm referencing it, when it comes to the Palestinian cause and its opponents. For I dare anyone to find a moment where the Palestinian cause was not the less powerful of the two forces in the conflict. Much is made of something like the 7 armies versus 1, and some outsized number of Muslim nations in the world, or Arab states, and the tiny population of Jews or Zionists. But this is simply laughably cynical mathematics when you add up the actual participants in these wars or clashes, and of course the financial and technological and organizational backing which one of the parties enjoyed. The Zionist effort, having the cooperation and support of the military, of the largest empire on planet Earth at just about every point in this story, or more accurately put, the foreign empire being the obstacle to the Palestinian cause, because, for example, famously, the British Empire did not fully cooperate with the Zionists before 1948, but they certainly were doing no favors to the Palestinians. I think all of that is relevant to the analogy at hand. So what would the analogy be here for the advice while being brutalized and suffering this injustice? Perhaps the obvious answer is to go to the legal body which is imagined to be the watchdog of sorts for the world. The United Nations is an obvious answer. And I dare say the Palestinian cause has tried that from day one, or more like day 0 or negative many, many days, as they've been arguing their case with mountains of evidence and emotional pleas well before 1948, or even well before the United Nations itself was birthed, going all the way back to World War I with appeals to the British Empire and through, of course, the ill-fated League of Nations. Okay, so what else? Perhaps a form of economic pressure, like a form of striking, protesting with your wallet, maybe in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr., if the violent actions of the Black Panthers, for example, were not your cup of tea. Well, you can all check the responses to something like the boycott, divest, sanction movement and the slander of being branded anti-Semitic for daring to engage in such a non-violent economic strike. And I could go on with the history of efforts which would seem to fit the analogy and advice which my opponent suggests. displays of solidarity, books appealing for justice, land negotiations, marches to the wall, everything else. And I would think that we'd all be bored by the repetitive and predictable nature of how each one is somehow branded as Jew hatred and dismissed out of hand, even when the particular nonviolent protest might be met with more brutality by Israel. But I have to keep going back to the question that I posed of when is resistance necessary, philosophically. And now I am meaning when is violent resistance necessary. Perhaps another way to understand this is when war is upon you, should you resist? Or is that a necessary condition in itself for resistance? Or is simply the denial of freedom and the humiliation by way of land seizure and domination a necessary condition for violent resistance? Because, of course, the history of the Palestinian resistance has not always faithfully followed my opponent's advice. There have been, of course, plenty of spectacles of violence dotted throughout the story of Palestinian resistance, though it is, I think, relevant to note how, just like plenty of other analogous situations of asymmetrical power and injustice and brutality, the violent actions tend to increase in frequency and intensity only after the nonviolent methods are exhausted, abandoned, or distrusted, when they're intellectually disabled and unplugged by various forms of calling them deranged terrorism, which of course is precisely what the charge of anti-Semitism is often doing in the relevant situation. And this is, sadly, precisely what my opponent has engaged in with a baffling level of ignorance and arrogance. The analogy here would be for him to suggest that a black man stay patient, take notice of his abuse, and then take the grievance to the highest court in the land to seek justice. But also, by the way, that highest court in the land is just a bunch of cop-hating racists and completely compromised, so anything they say or any opinion they render should be totally ignored anyway. This, I'm sure you can appreciate, leaves the brutalized in quite the bind. And it very much plays a role in the very processes of derangement, which my opponent would then say would unfortunately justify their extermination or expulsion. And this is the point in the opening statement where I'm obliged to mention that anti-Semitism is a real phenomenon along with all other forms of ethnic and religious hatred, and of course has coalesced in massively perverse ways in the world. So consider that obligation met, genuinely noted, and considered as one of the quite powerful weights of the senses of injustice, which ironically would factor into a kind of war of resistance and survival for Jewishness, whatever that means. Notice there that morally everyone wants to be cast as the resistors whose hands were forced, rather than the unprovoked warriors or the wagers of war who only wish to dominate and enrich themselves. This brings me to my final philosophical point, which is also to preemptively respond to the charges that are coming my way that I'm just hopelessly confused or naive about the nature of this particular form of evil and barbarism, which is on the table in this current engagement. And lurking under this position is ultimately a rehash of the perpetual clash of civilizations picture, which seems to always lurk here. That there's simply an almost objectively measured civilizational friend and civilizational foe who are at odds, and the cause of civilization is what determines who we ought to side with in some zero-sum utilitarian game, if we are civilized people. This tactic is old, needless to say, very old. It's been used to dehumanize during campaigns of slaughter, enslavement, and erasure in Africa, and the Americas, and Australia, of course. And these forms of domination and dehumanization are not reserved simply for white Europeans or Americans, but this appeal to a clash of civilizations has also been used as a companion piece to the derangement element I've emphasized here, in that kind of compassionate way. There's been a resurgence lately of reimagining something like colonialism as a benevolent force, an effort to stabilize and introduce forms of more godly morality or egalitarian ideals to those less fortunate, uncivilized populations of the world, to de-derange them, as it were. Perhaps this is best embodied by someone like General Pratt, who was an architect of the re-education schools in the Americas, which would take Native Americans and mold them into civilized citizens at schools, boarding schools, using whatever coercive and abusive means at their disposal. The motto of these schools in this effort was, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Meaning, of course, to flush out the barbaric tendencies and habits and uncivilized beliefs, and therefore save the child and have them participate in society and contribute. It's a sort of exorcism of culture, as it were, a salvaging of their doomed barbarism, a removing of bad software and keeping the hardware, which is perfectly good. This attitude, believe it or not, by Pratt was considered quite progressive at the time in the mid-1800s, which might reflect just how cruel much of the society was, which would have just as soon thrown away all the Native Americans altogether rather than embark on this expensive rescue mission. And I don't mean, again, to denigrate this attitude, which I think is perfectly echoed by my opponent's positions, but I do mean to cast some doubt or caution onto it. And here, the historical record can really not be ignored. There's a recent interesting trend of trying to sanitize the colonialism mission generally as one which did the world a favor, and that I think does point the needle towards the philosophical departure point between us. And I think the word barbarism here is useful to close my statement with. The etymology of this word is really quite interesting. It comes from the Greeks around the 8th century BCE. There were no people called the barbarians. It's not an ethnicity or nationality or religion. The word was used to describe the enemies of the Greeks. First the Carians, and then the Persians, and then the Egyptians, and the Scythians in later centuries, and wars then, who they were at war with. Then the Romans adapted it to describe the Gauls and the Germans and the Britons and so on. It was at first just an onomatopoeia. It was an insult to describe how the Greeks thought the language and speaking of their enemies sounded, just like bar, 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 which then settled into the slur of barbarian. So this sort of removal or denial of the power of language and reasoning could be kind of embossed on anyone out there then, this slur of barbarian, like zombies just mumbling. They couldn't be reasoned with. They lacked even language or minds which could comprehend these civilized ideas. They were deranged as barbarians. What to do? So perhaps it's interesting to note that a supposed civilizing mission of colonialism would wish to give these poor savages who only speak in barbar nonsense and gibberish the power of literacy, you would think, and language and civilized reasoning. Well, for one simple telling example of the historical records and pointing to literacy rates in something like the subcontinent of India in the early mid-1800s may have been as high as 35% or perhaps in the 30% range. And when the British Empire finished with their colonizing and civilizing missions by 1947, this number was about 15%, with female literacy at about 3%. And, to not only pick on the British Empire, the same story was repeated in the Philippines by the Spanish, in Congo by the Belgians, Algeria by the French, and so on. And I make this point just to, again, cast some doubt on my opponent's argumentation, which will surely emphasize just how confused I am about this particular form of barbarism, which cannot be considered or rationalized or reasoned with in the ways which I am putting forward. This one, he will tell you, is different and immune from these kinds of forms of terrestrial freedom-seeking, and is only interested in death and domination in this world. It can't be reasoned with. It would not even seek the kind of justice and freedom which my opponent advises other brutalized and oppressed peoples want to pursue. It is, in so many words, barbaric. And I'll point out here an area where my opponent and I do agree, which is our distaste for religion generally, and the ways in which it can focus a mind or many minds on inhumane reasoning. But labeling the Palestinian cause and its various efforts at resistance as jihadist or even Islamist is a deeply unserious thing to do, which is overwhelmingly defeated by honest historical evaluations. This is not to say that reasoning dripping with religious backing and purpose has not woven itself into the cause. But this is hardly unique in the history of the world, from Native American resistance movements to African slave revolts, to, dare I say, the Zionist militias engaged in their violence to establish the State of Israel. If we were to discount any liberation effort the moment it made contact with an otherworldly and religious impulse, dare I say that every single one would need to be opposed by civilized people. And so, I hope that you hear all of those arguments with a hefty dose of doubt and skepticism, and resist the temptation to adopt the charge of barbarism to justify slaughter or derangement processes and the tactics that Israel is using of what I've been calling lately collateral damage maximization policies. And so, I'll end with putting my finger now on where I think our deepest philosophical split actually lies. And it's on the question of what kind of worlds are worth winning and worth inhabiting. In other words, what worlds ought we not resist? What forms of oppression or freedom denial ought we not wage war with or war against of any kind? What shouldn't we resist? It's a way to flip the when is resistance necessary. And I would put forward that a world where all the supposed barbarians have been and continue to be endlessly eliminated by force, confinement, or re-education by whatever means is not a world worth winning, even if it is somehow a result of, tremendous technological advance or scientific knowledge. I contend that the moral infraction of the means to produce such a world cancels out its own forms of flourishing. And the technological gain that it enjoys is drained of any of its existential meaning. There, perhaps, I am describing a world of the supposed benevolent colonizer and civilized person, of which there seems to be many self-professed ones in this conversation. And I hope it's also understood that a world dominated by a different kind of freedom-crushing force of religious totalitarianism is also not a world worth winning or pursuing or not resisting. Both of these worlds should be fiercely resisted, which is an individual spiritual pursuit as well as a collective political one. And I think the first step is to grant each other non-barbaric status, that our capacity for language, for reasoning, and a love for freedom, even if we are afraid of that freedom, is universal. When power dynamics systemically silence one party, dismiss their grievances as deranged, and then weaponize their desperate response as proof of inherent barbarism, resistance ceases to be merely justified. It becomes urgently necessary. Therefore, it's incumbent upon all of us who genuinely cherish dignity and freedom to tirelessly aid all forms of legitimate resistance, from diplomatic efforts and economic pressures to cultural solidarity, and yes, sometimes armed struggle when all other pathways have been obstructed, sabotaged, or cynically branded as illegitimate. To abandon these avenues of resistance is to surrender to a convenient narrative that ultimately facilitates elimination and expulsion, outcomes disturbingly consistent with what some may have desired all along. Let us then have the courage to relentlessly prioritize justice and dignity, trusting ourselves never to lose sight of freedom as an unyielding and universal ideal, a force that inevitably finds its way to the surface, defying all oppressive power dynamics. Because a world in which the enslaved merely gets to choose their least worst masters is no freedom worth defending or killing for, even if you are quite sure that you will be a benevolent master. So there you have it. This is the part of the debate, I guess, where I would just sit down and be announced as the winner and everyone would go home. Just kidding. Of course, in truth, I don't expect actually anyone to respond to this who I had in mind. I don't expect a forthcoming response. But if it is written or delivered, it would be more than welcome. And the respondent can take about 33 minutes or so, whatever I took, because I took a big chunk of time in my statement. But in the meantime, like I said, I'm going to be posting some old episodes and conversations here every couple of weeks as I finish up the writing process of my book. And I really appreciate all of you out there. And go ahead, like, subscribe, all that stuff. I'll be back here in a few months. And yeah, I'll see you all then. Be well. Thanks so much.